Houthis shock the industry with a return to devastating and deadly attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, the role of watchkeeping in the digital age, and a $1 billion compensation ruling against the Express Pearl owners. All these stories and much more on the latest episode of Maritime in Minutes. Hi, it's Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News here, with our July news roundup, Maritime in Minutes, and I'm joined as usual by our correspondent Gary Howard. We'll be discussing the shipping news stories that stood out for us over the last month. Glancing through our picks for this month, and there is an extremely strong focus on security, casualties, and safety. Indeed, they feature in all but one story, which I believe, Gary, you are going to kick us off with.
Yeah, I'm going to start by bucking the trend of sort of bleakness and action with a bit of green news. Paul Bartlett picked up a report from DNV at the start of July, which looked at the trajectory for carbon capture systems through to 2050. The Class Society expects that carbon capture and storage will grow from the current level of 41 million tonnes of CO2 a year to 1.3 billion tonnes, or around 6% of global emissions by 2050, in its most likely outlook scenario. That would take an investment of around $700 billion over the next 25 years, and that doesn't actually take into account any marine systems, just those used in land-based industries like energy production, chemicals, that kind of thing. Net zero would require orders of magnitude more carbon capture and storage, however, said DNV. For ships, it said carbon capture storage systems are more suited for new vessels rather than retrofitting. Just enables a more holistic approach to minimise the energy use from the carbon capture systems, which is important. You don't want to be burning more fuel to run your carbon capture system. Makes plain sense. Unsurprisingly, regulations are going to be key to the uptake levels in the shipping sector. Carbon taxes will make abatement like carbon capture more commercially attractive. The EU ETS has incentives for carbon capture, and both the EU and IMO are due to review certain regulations with an eye to carbon capture as well. There was also a related piece on June 30th. The Global Centre for Maritime Decarbonisation carried out a pilot project demonstrating a full value chain for carbon capture. It took 25 tonnes of CO2 captured on board Evergreen's Evertop and used it in the production of a low-carbon calcium carbonate in China. This system was actually retrofitted onto a ship, but as DNV said, probably the most effective and likely scenario is these systems go on to new builds.
I actually see a bit of a conundrum there, because a lot of the things I've seen about carbon capture and why it's probably really good is because you can retrofit it onto existing vessels and get them to meet the targets. But anyway, there you go.
Yeah, and I've covered a few times a company called Stax in the US, which has these weird vacuums that go on the top of ships' exhausts, and they're integrating carbon capture into their systems as well for sort of at berth zero emissions. So I think there are a lot of different developments going on in the area.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to watch what happens. Now, I'm going to take this podcast into its sort of realms of vessels hitting each other or being attacked and so forth. My first pick of the month involves a court case that particularly piqued my interest and related to the collision between Singapore-flagged product tanker Hafnia Nile and the then Sao Tome and Principe-flagged VLCC Series 1 off the coast of Malaysia on 19th July last year. The collision resulted in the death of a seafarer on board the Series 1 and serious injury to another crew member of the VLCC. Two of the crew of the Hafnia Nile, in charge of navigation and watchkeeping at the time of the incident, have been charged in the Singapore State Courts under the country's Merchant Shipping Act. Now, I've got to say, this actually came as something of a surprise to me, as everything I've heard about this incident painted the Series 1 as a dark fleet vessel. Indeed, it was later sanctioned, and one that was drifting with its AIS turned off and in a place that it shouldn't have been, that caused a collision with the well-managed Hafnia Nile. The Hafnia Nile is part of the BW Group. I've heard senior executives from the company speaking publicly about how the incident illustrated the dangers of the dark fleet. However, it would seem the Singapore authorities have taken a somewhat different view. It was reported based on the charge sheets that the officer in charge of navigation and watch on the Hafnia Nile allegedly failed to make a full appraisal of the situation and the risk of dangers to navigation, maintain situational awareness of the area around the Hafnia Nile, and ensure proper lookout was maintained, while a second officer steered the vessel when directed not to do so. If found guilty, both the accused can be each jailed for up to 2 years or fined 50,000 Singapore dollars, or both. It's a case we'll be watching with interest to see what happens. If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice.
I'll take us into the second week and a couple of stories that I think everyone knew was going to be in here. There's been a period of calm in the Red Sea for the first 6 months of the year. Most major shipping lines have continued to avoid transiting the area, and there was sort of a stark reminder of why on the 6th of July. Bulker Magic Seas was attacked off the coast of Yemen by the Houthi, who launched 2 unmanned service vessels, 5 ballistic and cruise missiles, and 3 drones at the ship. The vessel was left on fire and taking on water, leading the 22 seafarers on board to abandon ship. Fortunately, in this case, they were all rescued by a passing merchant vessel. The Houthi released a video of the attack on the ship and a subsequent boarding as well. The detonation of explosive charges around the ship's hull is also shown, and the camera keeps rolling as the ship sinks. This video is pretty reminiscent of previous Houthi videos, both of the Galaxy Leader hijacking and the boarding of tanker Sunian, which had explosives placed on board. The day after the Magic Seas attack, bulker Eternity Sea was also attacked by a Houthi unmanned surface vessel and 6 cruise and ballistic missiles, according to the rebel group. 4 seafarers are thought to have died in that attack, with the remainder rescued after extensive 48-hour search and rescue operations. More on that in a bit. Another Houthi video followed for Eternity Sea, showing the launch and impact of missiles targeting the ship. The ship's bridge and accommodation block are seen pretty well charred up. There's a large hole in a cargo hatch, and perhaps more importantly, a major hole in the ship's hull. No footage of a boarding this time, but there is a time-lapse to show the ship eventually sinking. The Houthis say the ships were both targeted as part of the group's naval blockade of Israeli ports. Eternity Sea was on its way to Israel, while Magic Sea's owner owns vessels which have called Israel in recent months. Yeah, I think that about covers the facts of the attacks. Marcus, I think you're picking up the industry response to the reignition of the troubles in the Red Sea.
Indeed, and I don't think it's going to come as any surprise that the industry responded with a mixture of shock and condemnation. Among the statements issued was a joint one from ICS, BIMCO, the European Shippers Owners Association, Intercargo and Intertanko, which read, "These vessels have been attacked with callous disregard for the lives of innocent civilian seafarers, and as an inevitable but terrible consequence, seafarers have been killed." Meanwhile, World Shipping Council President and CEO Joe Kramick stated, "What we're seeing unfold in the Red Sea is shocking and unacceptable. Seafarers are being killed while simply doing their jobs." The following week, in a speech in Singapore, IMO Secretary General Arsenio Dominguez condemned what he described as cowardly attacks and said shipping should not become collateral damage in geopolitical situations. I managed to ask the Secretary General if there was anything that could actually really be done, and he stressed the importance of security assessments by ship owners and management, and that he was working with several member states to try and bridge the gap in talking with the Houthi. Hopefully we have some success there. It was also good to see Ardmore Shipping senior executive Mark Cameron calling out owners who knowingly put their seafarers in dangerous situations in high-risk zones. Speaking at the Nautical Institute Singapore conference, Cameron, a former seafarer himself, described the actions of some owners putting their vessels through the Red Sea despite knowing the risks as shameful and disgusting.
Yeah, I think especially if you know that you're going to be calling it Israel, there's an obvious heightened risk there, which is now very apparent since the beginning of July for sure. On to third week, I suppose. I was reading the UK Marine Accident Investigation Branch's annual report, as you do, and I was surprised by a bit of messaging in there from the organisation's Chief Inspector of Marine Incidents. For what it's worth, I think Marcus was less surprised. On the report's release, MAIB's Andrew Moll commented that incidents contained in the report and that have happened since, quote, indicate a need to radically rethink the role of human watchkeepers in the digital age. Humans do not make good monitors, and if understimulated, they will find other things to occupy themselves. While I don't disagree with the statement on the shortcomings of humans when it comes to paying attention, the phrase human watchkeepers in the digital age could have some worrying that, the robots and technology are coming to replace seafarers as watchkeepers. Moll noted a number of incidents where poor watchkeeping and distractions played a role, including a few that resulted in fatalities. He also noted a reluctance among some seafarers to use ECDIS features that would warn of potential issues. Silence alarms were noted in several incident reports released in 2024, and going way back, I think MAIB cooperated on a study into this in 2021 or maybe earlier than that. Marcus, you chipped in a quote from the Nautical Institute Singapore event again that you attended. I think it was maybe the same day I wrote this story. This wasn't related to the MAIB release, but is very relevant. John Martin, CEO of Guard Singapore, said, "Apparently now ECDIS delivers unprecedented situational awareness, but a note of caution on that. We're all familiar with the term radar-assisted collisions, where the instruments are not actually perfect, and if the training is not right, and I've seen that in my time where collisions have sometimes happened because the data is misinterpreted." The comments from MIB and Guard will be among many as the industry gets to grips with the balancing of safety and commercial implications of digital technologies on board, whether that's technology on the bridge to assist the crew or the technology in their pockets helping to distract them. We'll keep you all updated on Seatrade Maritime News as this story keeps rolling on, but I expect the topic will also come up at Crew Connect Global in Manila in November later this year.
I expect it will, actually. And I think, these sort of virtual watchkeepers are probably, going to be part of the future. Coming to an issue that's a lot more sort of manual, shall we say, the busy Singapore Strait has long had an issue of vessels being boarded by Indonesian armed groups seeking to steal stores, valuables, engine parts, and similars. The frequency of such incidents has waxed and waned down the years. However, the numbers of boardings has become increasingly alarming since the second half of last year. The first half of this year saw ship robberies in the Singapore Strait at over a decade high, with 79 incidents reported according to the Recap Information Sharing Centre, and a further 11 incidents in the first week of July alone. The incidents are clustered around the eastbound lane of the traffic separation scheme in Indonesian waters. A factor highlighted in the surge of incidents was the lack of arrests and prosecutions of pirate groups by the Indonesian authorities in recent times. This changed on 9th July, when the Riau Islands Regional Water Police apprehended a group trying to board a tanker in the Phillips Channel and made further arrests on land. It would appear to have had an impact, and in the 3 weeks since, there have been no further boarding incidents reported. Caution is, though, still advised for ships transiting the area, as at least 2 other groups are still believed to be active.
Yeah, this is one of these stories that just keeps coming back, I think, over my 14, 15 years in maritime news. It's one that you've, I think, always had an eye on.
No, I don't think it'll ever actually be completely stopped. It's just a case of taking action to sort of push it back down again.
Okay, my last one for this month. And returning to the Red Sea attacks for my final pick, the Houthi released a propaganda video showing the crew of Eternity Sea. This video opens with the men in life jackets being pulled from the water in the dark, and then shows some interviews with the crew members being asked questions about events in the lead up to the Houthi strikes on the vessel and the crew's subsequent treatment at the Houthis' hands. Questions like whether they knew that they were sailing to Israel, that sort of thing. Some crew were also showed calling home, and on one call, apparently between a seafarer and his mother, the woman on the other end of the phone is heard asking, "Where are you? We heard that you were dead." There are a few heavily staged segments where the crew apologise to the Palestinian people and warn other seafarers and shipping companies not to have dealings with Israel. I find it hard to pick the right words to describe the Houthi pulling the group of seafarers from the water in the dark. Rescue seems perhaps overly generous, given the Houthi themselves caused the crew to abandon ship and indeed killed some of their colleagues, but kidnap also seems a little bit strong. Both are accurate though. It's currently unclear whether the seafarers are now free to leave Yemen. It's probably safe to presume that they are being held, but the conditions and the initial treatment seem better than endured by the crew of Galaxy Leader, who were held for, I think, 14 months by the Houthi. The video at least seems to show that the crew are in good spirits and in good health, 2 of them receiving medical attention. And there was also another Houthi video released later that same day showing the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Deputy Chief of Staff visiting the crew. Some of the crew was smiling and laughing during that meeting, but perhaps under some form of duress, who knows. To my knowledge, up until the video was released, there had not been confirmation on the number of crew held by the Houthi, And while there are bound to be very complex thoughts and emotions around the current situation, I am at least relieved that the death count from the attack on Eternity Sea has reduced by at least 10 seafarers. I'm trying to find out more on the seafarer situation, and I've got some questions over there with the Houthi, and we'll update the site as soon as I find out more.
Yeah, just to add to that, since you wrote that story overnight, the owners of Cosmo Ship Management issued a statement saying they were deeply relieved that the footage showed the 10 seafarers to be alive and apparently receiving care. However, they did not appear to have any further information beyond what was released in that video.
Yeah, you always assume there's some kind of back-channel communications going on behind the scenes that we're not privy to, but it sounds like this propaganda video was where everyone learned that those men were still alive, except possibly those few family members that received phone calls.
Indeed, and I agree with you. At least we know that they are still alive, and that is a positive. To round out this episode, I'm going to go back to an incident that happened 4 years ago. The Express Pearl was back in the headlines 4 years since the month-old ship was destroyed by fire and explosion off Sri Lanka that resulted from a leaking cargo of nitric acid in a container. It is a story we have covered in some detail, including an interview with the vessel's former master, Vitale Chulakalo, last year, which I'll link in the show notes and gives a complete rundown of what happened to the ill-fated Express Pearl. A case seeking compensation for environmental damage to coastal and fishing communities in Sri Lanka following the vessel's destruction was brought to the country's Supreme Court. The Supreme Court delivered its judgment last week, highlighting unprecedented devastation to the country's marine environment and the world's largest ever spill of microplastics or nodules from containers on board the vessel. The ruling, which runs to some 361 pages, was critical of a large number of respondents to the case, including many Sri Lankan state parties, but the burden of compensation was ultimately placed on the owners and related parties of the Express Pearl. The judgment found for the purpose of trying to gain entry to the Port of Colombo, the master operator and local agents of the Express Pearl intentionally suppressed and withheld from the harbour master of Colombo Port truthful, timely, comprehensive, and accurate information regarding the situation that evolved over a period of time and prevailed at the aforestated vessel entering the territorial waters of Sri Lanka. Singapore-based Sea Consortium and Express Feeders, which owned and operated the vessel, were ordered to pay $1 billion in compensation. Express Feeders said it was extremely disappointed in the judgment and was reviewing the ruling. It is a case that's certainly going to be watched closely by parties related to a number of recent container casualties off the coast of neighbouring India involving MSC and Wanhai vessels. And that is all we have time for on this episode of Maritime in Minutes. Links to all the stories discussed are in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to joining you on the next episode of the Seatrade Maritime Podcast.